And yeah, it's our last presentation today here in this room. And we present Amjad Zoghbi. He's a co-founder of Xmon. He founded it in 2013 and is now working as director at Xmon. And his topic today is proactive reference data management. And yeah, the stage is yours.
Lovely. Thank you, Jessica, for the introduction. So I am one of the founders of a company called Xmon. We built software for data operations and usage monitoring. And as Jessica mentioned, as of January 2013, 2024, this year, we are now part of the TRG Screen group and have been acquired by TRG Screen this year. So I'll be talking to you today about reference data, in particular the aspects of usage monitoring, what we mean by proactive usage monitoring, why it's important to do that, and then we'll talk about how to do it at a high level and a little bit show you a little bit as well what happens if we implement the right methods for proactive reference data management. Just some wording on the agenda first before we start. This is what we'll go through today. I know it's the last session of the afternoon. It won't take that long, but we'll go through a few of the points. First, we'll start by defining what we mean by reference data, setting the scene up in terms of the complexities around it. We'll then do a high-level view in an organization and see what difference is between data consumers and the people managing that data or the market data management teams. We'll talk about the challenges that some of us face in managing reference data, both technical and non-technical as well. Then we'll start looking at the how part. What we aim to achieve before we start implementing those changes. What are our objectives when we say better managing reference data? We'll talk about what we need to do in terms of the different elements that might feed in a proper effective reference data management strategy. We'll talk about recommended architectures, and then I'll show you a little bit some client stories about people that have, or organizations just like yours that have managed to implement those mechanisms and what they've achieved at that. I guess it's a small group today, so if you have any questions, feel free to just ask them as we go. If we feel that we're out of time, I'll let you know, but it should be fine, absolutely, in terms of the people today. So let's go ahead. So in terms of just a few definitions, setting the scene here, when we talk about reference data, we mean data that is non-streaming or non-delayed or non-terminal related feeds. It's the word that we use for this. It is not a business representation of the data, so that includes end-of-day prices, that includes closing prices, but we just call it that way. It is data that can be stored in your systems and then distributed and reused in the organization. Now, this data comes with different challenges, as you probably know them all. It is an expensive data. It is a big part of the market data budgets in organizations. We see 10 to 30%. Some clients might be more, some clients might be less. Some clients will have tens of millions of dollars spent on reference data. So this is by no means a small part of the budgets, and it needs to be looked at. The commercials are complex as well. Different vendors will provide that data in different ways. Generally speaking, there are metered models, so every time you ask for data, you'll be charged for it, but there are, of course, other models as well. There are banded models, there are enterprise deals, pay a fixed fee and then get everything you need. They're volume-based, it goes on. So vendors will have implemented them differently. Some vendors are much more complex than others, as you know, and we'll have them all. So again, from a commercial standpoint, it is not an easy area to look into either. And finally, in terms of the complexity, there are, in addition to all of these two things, complex licensing requirements. We cannot do we cannot do anything we want with that data, let's put it that way. And not only this is what we call license liable attributes. There are also considerations to look into from a feed-through perspective. So you might buy data from a vendor, and that vendor will provide you with that data, but you need to report this data to the actual originator. So you might buy data from Bloomberg, but it's actually S&P data or Fitch data, and you need to know that and you need to be able to report that. Now, we think one of the problems, it's not the only issue there, but we think one of the challenges or one of the issues with the complexities or the difficulty in managing reference data is the fact that and most of the time, we're sitting in a passive position. So what we mean by this is that most of the organizations that we see are waiting for the invoices to come in at the end of the month. So they only get the invoices at the end of the month, and all the management and processing is done based on post-fact data. So we look at the invoices, we look at the numbers on the invoices. We hope they haven't changed by much, and we pay the invoices, basically. We might do some allocations, but it is static. It is not always fair. It is not always based on usage. So one of the fundamental issues, we'll come back to that in a bit more in terms of explaining what other challenges we have, but we think one of the fundamental problems is that it is a passive management. And we really think we can do better than that, it's in particular with all the things that we've said here. So before I go ahead and look into this in more detail, I think it's also important to make a distinction between data consumers in the organization and actually the people that manage usage and spend. It is a clear distinction here that sometimes gets a bit blurred or a bit unclear, but we make a clear distinction between the consumers of the data, the people that actually need the data, use it for their reports, for their businesses, for their analysis, etc. So these are the teams that will look at the data quality aspects. These are the teams that will store the data in their own systems and reuse it and build actual business value out of that data. This is usually done by the application owners, the business lines, or the IT teams. In the world that we're at here at the moment, we are looking more at the teams that manage usage and spend. Generally speaking, they are market data teams, but it depends on the organization size. It can be also cross-vendor, more global functions, etc. But I think the important part here is to make that distinction. And these are the teams that actually process the invoices, monitor spend, reconcile the invoices, etc. Now, this doesn't mean that these two teams do not speak together, of course. It is important to have that communication between these two functions. On the left-hand side, the business will ask market data team, how much does this data point cost me? Am I compliant in my usage? Are there alternative fields that I can pull down that you can help me with? And of course, the market data teams, if we can put it that way, also need to speak to the business owners and say, do you actually need that data? Did you know how much it costs? Here's a rundown of a simulation for a particular call that you make. So it is important to have this clear communication between these two entities. And it's not easy, partly as well, like we said, because the market data team is in a passive position. So most of the time, this function is receiving invoices, looking at the numbers, maybe reporting any abnormalities and paying the invoices. So what happens if we don't manage it properly? What is the impact of what we call passive reference data management? There are 3 items here. Of course, we can go on the list, but the most important ones are the increased operational risk. Costs are not understood. They can increase, they can be volatile. They can increase certainly over time. So if you look at your spend today versus 5 years ago, it's not clear what the drivers of that increase might be. It's difficult to forecast, and we might be non-compliant as well. It's also not a very efficient way of doing things because we don't understand our billing. If more and more organizations are interested in allocating spend, if you've used data, then it's important that you pay for that data that you've used. But it's difficult to allocate spend when we don't know who's consuming what. So we're not very efficient in this, and it can take a long time to generate reports. So in most cases, it can take days, if not weeks, to get a report out. And if we do get this report out, maybe the business has moved on. So we're always after the fact. It is important to make decisions based on data, and based on facts, and based on repeatable processes. Being passively managing this data is not a way to make those decisions. So it's difficult to have accountability from our providers. How can we be sure that the number in that invoice that we're getting is matching our commercial models and our spend? We take these numbers at face value, but how can we keep the vendors accountable? Even in negotiations as well, it's important to know how our organization uses data so that we can be in a good position when we talk about with the vendors out there, just to know how our teams need data and which data they need, which data they don't need. So all of this comes back into the category of it's difficult to make decisions when we don't have enough information. Now, market data teams have different challenges. I think one of the first 2 ones here are really technical and related to the type of data that we talked about. So we talked about already the complex commercials and reference data, and we talked about the complexities in licensing. I'll call these the technical aspects of the reference data itself. They come with the type of data that we're dealing with. But of course, it's not just technical in organizations. There are functional challenges as well. Requirements change from the business. So market data teams have to deal with evolving needs, evolving requirements. We might add new asset classes. We might add new attributes. We might buy organizations. So it's an evolving landscape, of course. We have to deal also with legacy architectures. These are things that have been done in some ways for the last 10, 20 years, even longer sometimes. So the change is not easy. and there is a legacy that we need that needs to be dealt with. So sometimes we speak to market data teams and they just have no idea who's requesting what. We've got many vendors, we've got many accounts. It's a very difficult legacy architecture. We talked about this. I put it here. It is after the fact. We are managing data after the fact. So by the time we realize what's happened, it's too late. And going back to this takes a long, long time. There is too much data. If we really wanted to look into it in a detailed way, there's a lot of information to collect, and there's a lot of data, and we just don't have the time. There is so many things on our plate. We don't just deal with reference data. We have other things to, in terms of our remit for our role. So there are many challenges around this. I'm sure you might be able to add to that list. So feel free to, if we haven't covered it, but we speak to market data, and we've kind of tried to collect these types of challenges across the board. Now, it doesn't mean we can't do anything about that. What we try to do, really, before we start talking about how and kind of building these solutions around it, what we're trying to achieve first is better governance, transparency, and accountability for data usage in our organization. So this involves building reports, generating reports in a timely way, simulations, running what-if scenarios, allocating spend in a clear way as well. But also, it's changing that dynamic from being in a passive position, waiting for the invoices to come in and processing them, to being in a more proactive situation. And this doesn't just open up the terms of the data that we have access to, but now we can build interesting functionality or features that we could not do before. We will talk about this in a bit, but tracking usage in real time means that we know the spend, we know how much we're spending on a daily basis, we can create alerts in the system, we'll talk about all of these things, and we can even block or limit access to non-compliant data. So all of these features open up when we change the dynamic from being in a passive situation to being in a more proactive situation. Of course, none of this is possible with manual work or in Excel spreadsheets. It is important to have technology in place. Now, we need to be able to process large amounts of data. We'll talk about that in a bit, what that large data means, but we need systems to help us process this in a timely way. And part of this processing is to have the ability to recreate or reproduce or run simulations and what-if scenarios in a repeatable way that doesn't take us 1 or 2 weeks or 3 weeks. So these are the objectives that we're trying to look at here. Now, what do we need to do that? We're going to break this down. Of course, it's not an architecture kind of diagram here, but it'll be more kind of the elements that would feed in potentially a system. So this is how we do it really. On one side, we need those requests for data. These are the calls that our systems are making out to our different providers. They can be internal, they can be external. But from those requests for data, we need to be able to extract identifiers, attributes, and other parameters for that particular call. That is one input that we'll need into the application. The second thing we need is the mapping of dictionaries. Vendors will have their own. If you have a mastering system as well, we can get the dictionary from that application. But really, here it's about mapping data attributes to categories and a security reference to asset classes. But this is another element that will feed into the system. And the third one, you probably guessed it, is the commercial models. How are we being charged for data? And it could be either of those models. There's probably maybe another 1 or 2 to add in here. But how are we being charged for data? Is it a metered model? Is it a quota-based model? Banded model? Volume? Enterprise? We talked about all of these things. Of course, the invoices do come in at the end of the month. They also form part of the data points that we require, or the attributes here. And we mix all of those for every vendor that you have. We've put in also, it's not just about vendors, we call them sources of data. So of course, a vendor is a source of data. A source of data is where you get the data from. It could be a vendor, but it can also be a process for internal data sources as well. Your security masters. Of course, you may or may not have a commercial model in that case, and you may not have an invoice. But this will apply as well for internal sources. Now we'll take that data, all of it, in terms of these different attributes, and plug it into some technology. Okay, and that technology will map the identifiers, parse the files, map the identifiers, and run real-time calculations on this information. Now we're able to do this nowadays because of cloud or because of newer technologies, but basically this is all high-volume data processing and reconciliation at the end. As I said earlier, once you do this in the technology and you have a system that can actually run through the numbers, run through the formats, and do all of this dynamically, then we can open up a new set of functionality that we could not do before. So reporting, analytics in a timely way, running what-if scenarios and simulations. If the business asks us a question, how much is this going to cost me? What is the impact of a new vendor commercial model? We can answer those questions in a much more repeatable and much more time-efficient way. Now that we know these requests, we know who's sending them, we know where they're going to, we can allocate spend back in a fair way to our consumers if we wanted to do that. Not only can we allocate spend fairly, but we can also now say, this is your allocated spend, but this is also your allocated usage. We know what you've consumed, so this is your allocated usage report as well. This will drive interesting conversations in the organization because consumers can now say, oh, I don't really need that data. I didn't know it cost me that much. So we start coming back to that first slide, facilitating that conversation between the market data teams and the business and the data consumers. We talked about rules and alerts in a bit. By tracking consumption like this and mapping it to commercial models in real time, we can create rules in the system. So if somebody overspends or makes a request that's non-compliant, it can be captured in real time. And we can act on it, either block it or let somebody know or work on it. Reconciling invoices is also very important. Coming back to the point of accountability earlier, if we get an invoice, how can we be sure that that number in the invoice matches our usage? This is what we call invoice reconciliation. It is an important part to do. It is important to validate that we are on the same understanding as our sources of data. And of course, cost optimization is, yeah?
You mentioned earlier abnormal usage of data.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that we can monitor through rules and alerts? Or is
Yeah.
there any other way that the system would flag?
Abnormal usage? Absolutely. No, that's a great question. Thank you for this. So abnormal usage is understanding what is normal and then basing on this what is then abnormal. And with a system like this, once we have the map of our consumption, then we can start collecting those benchmarks for what we would consider as normal consumption. And then this would feed into the rules engine, exactly to your point. If something varies from these parameters, say over the last 6 months, nobody's requested corporate action data. Suddenly somebody sends a corporate action request. Now the rules engine there, of course, is not only let's say a binary, a check, not only say a static check. Somebody has created a rule that says if someone requests corporate action data, let me know. Certainly you can do it that way. But it would be much better to build the benchmarking and the normalization levels automatically. This is where the systems that we have here can be very clever. Of course, everybody talks about AI and things like this, but this is typically a great implementation for machine learning models because they can learn your normal rates and then start figuring out what is abnormal. It could be something about cost abnormality. It could be something about data category abnormality. It could be something about particular fields or security asset class, etc. So yes, you can. It's understanding what is your normal versus what suddenly has happened. Patterns. And of course, like I said earlier, not just having it statically configured, but having the system automatically understand that. And of course, the last part of the whole chain here is optimizing spend. Everybody talks about spend. Why would we want to spend money on data that we don't need? Why would we want to spend money on data on things that we can optimize? It is very complex. And I think with a system like this, the great part is that cost reduction is very tangible. Not every system that we put in place in an organization, we can measure cost reduction so tangibly as a system like that. Yes, we can install applications, but yes, they will bring us improvements around processes, workflows, etc. But it's not every application that will have a tangible reduction in spend.
What's the average cost saving that you can save?
Thank you for this question.
Optimization.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a slide for you. This comes up a lot, but thank you for the question. It comes up a lot. I will show you, when we talk about what clients have, several use cases have done, I'll show you what this comes up with. But that's a very, of course, important question. Okay, so again, it's maybe a bit high level and meta, but essentially, of course, we have a system that does this, but this is how we do it. Now, one more thing before we talk about the use cases, we have what we call recommended architectures for data, and just so, I'll put it out there. These are the different data sources vendors sit outside your organization. Typically, they get your applications, you might have multiple consumers pulling data down from these vendors, right? And they might have it in here, they might distribute it downwards or not. But in a recommended architecture, you will have one or more data mastering systems. This is not data caching. This is data mastering. This is an EDM system. An application that would pull data down from multiple vendors out there, store it, enhance its quality, and then redistribute it downstream. It might have optimization capabilities, meaning that if it has already requested data once, it will not do it again for certain categories. But it is not a data caching system. So in terms of a high-level recommended architecture, organizations will have at least one mastering system of a certain size, will have at least one data mastering system that will consolidate feeds from different providers and then redistribute those internally. Then we would plug in what we just talked about in terms of usage tracking, inbound, so data coming in from these external vendors into your mastering system, so that we can track spend, we can allocate it, we can understand who's consuming what, create the rules that we talked about. But we can also plug it downstream here too, so that we know if we're buying data, where's that data going? So an example of this is, are we buying data and storing it in the mastering system, but nobody's pulling it down there? Now, what can we achieve with this? A few things. First and foremost, cost optimization. Now, I put this here because people like you always ask about what we can achieve there. This is what happens when we have access to the data. This is what happens when we understand and act, and not just do it once. This is not a one-off exercise. This is a continuous exercise. Yes, it can vary up and down, but in most cases, it goes down and settles down. And this is, the point I was making earlier, this is a tangible realization of the cost reduction. There's many things to talk about here. There's many reasons why we do this, but these are 4 cases for you. It's around 10 to 30% average. Of course, cost is important, but it's not just about cost. When you have a system like this, then you can start building up a proper governance or a proper value add to the business. So we enhance our efficiency, like we mentioned earlier in the presentation. We're more transparent, we're more in control. We will optimize our spend, of course, as we talked about. Accountability is there, internal and external accountability, and compliance. It's a data-driven system. Now, all of these things come back and solve our problems or the initial issues that we had. So we lower our operational risk. We've got the data, we've got the facts. We increase our efficiency. We don't spend weeks or days building reports. And we can now build decisions based on factual and represented data. And we've saved cost in the process. Make sense? Thank you. Any questions? Does that resonate? Thank you. Any questions, final comments? No pressure. The ice cream is being eaten. Yes. But if you have any questions or anything like this, yeah, feel free. Jessica, yes?
Is your system a proxy, a gateway to the data request? So are you storing... So one of the things you mentioned there was you can block requests that don't meet certain criteria. Right?
Correct.
And that whether it's, you've already requested this today,
yeah,
therefore you shouldn't request it again.
Correct.
And I assume we're talking about Bloomberg data license.
Bloomberg is one of the vendors, yeah, indeed. Yeah.
So, and you mentioned 20 to 30%, and typically 20 to 30% is in duplicate requests. And the total spend on Bloomberg, and that's anecdotal.
We've seen that differently.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've seen that differently. In fact, so to answer the first part of the question, I don't know, did you, sorry, I don't want to.
Yeah, the first part was,
okay.
Is it a proxy, is it a real-time proxy, so it's
yeah,
actually sitting between the requester
yeah,
and the Bloomberg data license in this case?
yeah, yeah. Yeah.
So therefore you're not sending out a duplicate
Yeah.
request.
You could put it that way.
Sorry?
You can put it that way. It doesn't have to be. It does not have to be. It can be. If you wanted certainly to use the blocking functionality of the system, then you need an application that would be a proxy for you if you needed to use this functionality. But our system at least does not force you to have that mode. You can have different integrations. Of course, they will not allow you to block things. That needs to be, you need to use it as a proxy. But the application, so our product, Xmon, will allow you to do different integration types for different purposes. Because clients might say, this is a production system, I don't want to block anything. In fact, I don't even want anything between you and my vendor or my source of data. That's fine, but I still want to track and understand how that system is consuming data. So give us a copy of those files, potentially of the request, etc. But it might be a different conversation for test environments or development environments or interns that come into the organization. And in which case you might want to put them. So it depends on what we're wanting to do. I think in terms of the cost-saving opportunities there, it breaks down. I mean, the models are so complex, as you know. So there's an ample opportunity for looking at, are we making the best of the commercial models available to us? Even within the same vendors that we have, is there a better way to leverage the models that they're offering us, right? So in terms of reduction, yeah, and I mean, it would be very inefficient for clients to be requesting data over and over again to the point of the multi-hits. That's a very inefficient way of doing things. Of course, we see that, but it's not the only way. There's many other alternative options to look at that are specific to the vendor models that you have. Hope that helps. Any questions? Comments? Thank you very much for attending the last session of the afternoon. Jessica, if you wanted to do some final closing comments, or am I putting you on the spot here?
No,
it's fine. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks for the audience today.
Thank you, and I'll see you at the ice cream bar. Thank you.